This on. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. The Land Use and Natural Resources Committee. Today's Thursday, August 1st. And to begin, we will have Pamela, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Oh. Pick up the
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. All right, clerk, will you call roll, please?
Yes, good afternoon, directors. When I call your name, please indicate your presence. Director Bullhan,
I'm here.
Frost. Here. Harris is in the building but currently absent. Hume,
Here.
Kozlowski,
Here.
Teeter.
Here.
Vice Chair Baines, also in the building but currently absent. Vice Chair Lozano.
Here.
Chair Villegas.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Very good. Thank you for that. Did we receive or do we have any public communication?
There's no public comment at this time.
No public comment at the moment. All right, so with that, then we will take up our consent item. We only have one item on consent, and that is the minutes of our June 6th meeting. Any questions or comments on consent?
I'll move approval of the consent calendar.
We have a motion.
I'll second.
We have a second by Director Baines. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so approval of the consent minutes are approved unanimously. All right, so next item is action items. Item 2 is revised Green Means Go program budget and awards.
Great. Well, Garrett Baldrosa here, SACOG staff. A little bit of context for your action item on consideration. Of course, we have the Green Means Go program, a regional program about what investments and partnerships we can be making to revitalize our existing communities, our infill corridors, and what's called at the local level your green zone. So all 28 jurisdictions have supported Green Means Go. 26 of the 28 have adopted those local green zones, those areas for infill development. A lot of work went into standing up this Green Means Go program. Sort of the feather in our cap was the state validating the thesis around Green Means Go and the need of it with this $34 million investment into the Sacramento region for Green Means Go. We executed a contract with the state for that Green Means Go, and then the SACOG board adopted awards in that program to fully allocate that $34 million. So that's a Green Means Go program. The budget was fully expended, fully allocated. Well, of course, fast forward that was all in 2023. Fast forward to a few months ago, right? Of course, the state fiscal situation took a turn for the worse. And so unfortunately, this Green Means Go program, which is fully allocated in our region, got caught up in sort of some budget negotiations. At one point, there was a proposal on the table from the governor to cut the program by 50%. We've been working very closely with the jurisdictions and partners that have supported Green Means Go, demonstrating the need for the program, communicating how these awards are committed, they're encumbered, they're very much in process of moving forward. Ultimately, where I landed with the budget negotiation was the program got cut by 6%. So a far cry from the 50% we were fearing. So that's the great news. You know, it's frustrating to be having to talk about a 6% cut. We also want to acknowledge all the work that we did collectively to preserve that Green Means Go program. The state acronym you see in the staff report is REAP, but here, of course, we call it Green Means Go. Many programs in the state, right, would be very thankful to only have a 6% haircut. So for us to preserve 94% of the original budget is a testament to the value I think we were able to demonstrate for this program. But of course, we still now have to address the 6% cut on a fully committed program. So you see in the staff report, there's 3 areas of expenditures remaining. There are what we call the capital awards. These are actual infrastructure projects that have gone to 8 jurisdictions that do things like build a sewer upgrade or stormwater or wastewater in those local green zones. There's some planning awards, so 13 planning awards to help get green zone corridors ready for the next phase of capital investment. And there's a technical assistance and monitoring arm to complement that. So collectively, right, we need to make up about $1.9 million to cover that 6% cut. The staff recommendation before you today is for across the board 6%. I should specify 6.2% cut across all 3 of those categories: the capital awards, the planning awards, and the technical assistance activities. Throughout this whole process, we've been in constant communication with the awardees, right, giving them updates about where we landed. So we feel very confident, given that 6% is much less than the 50% relatively we feared early on, that these projects have been thinking about what they could do with a budget cut. We've been talking with all of them. Given 6% is a relatively small number, we feel confident that these projects can move forward, right? And so that's why we're recommending across the board, 6% across those categories. Uh, we're paying particular attention to the capital, i.e. infrastructure projects, and that these funds need to be expended by June of 2026. The unfortunate thing is, given all this uncertainty, there was really a pause of about 8 months on this program. No capital project's going to move forward and start, turning dirt and laying pipe without their budget secured. Unfortunately, the original deadline to expend these funds that were given us by the state, that June 2026, has not been extended. So it's really now time to get these projects moving forward. So why we're really hoping for a recommendation today to go to the full board is for now to give those projects a certainty about what budget is coming from this Green Means Go, so they can actually now meet that grant timeline. So more details in the staff report, but I'll pause there and see what questions you have for your action item today.
Very good. Thank you, Garrett. Any questions at this point?
I have one, to the extent that it is necessary, could the awards, Folsom has 3 small awards. Could the cut all come from 1 or 2 instead of all 3?
Well,
So we have some discretion, I guess, to move between the buckets.
So the second part of the staff recommendation would be to delegate to the executive director the ability to, again, we think that we'll be able to keep all projects moving forward through a combination of additional local funds and some minor scope changes. But it gives the executive director the authority to execute any amendments within those awards.
And I won't text message my city manager. Thank you.
Director Lozano.
Yeah, not really a big question, but when we were doing the preparation for the agenda, one of the things popped in my head was it's 1.9 million. Is there anywhere in the SACOG budget that would be able to absorb that to then make the Green Means Go whole? Or, and I think Clint gave a pretty good explanation of how that could work moving forward, but doing the 6% now would then allow people to continue the project, and then as it unfolds, there may be the ability to find some extra grant money or stuff like that to help offset it.
Yeah, I think what I was mentioning is there are some potential future grant fundings. There's a UMB program, hopefully, that gets fully funded at the federal level, and we will keep our eyes on those other funding opportunities. One of the unique challenges we talked about with this program is it's paying for infrastructure that we don't have normal streams of revenue coming, right? It's all transportation focused here. This is kind of that underground stuff. And so we don't have money, ready to go, but we are keeping our eyes peeled, and we have a couple of leads on other federal grant programs that we might be able to tackle to fill gaps as needed, or bring other projects in.
Yeah, thank you, Clint. I just thought that it'd be good for the group to hear that, because at least that popped into my mind is, but the idea of finding other funding to help make it whole at some point. Thanks.
Any other questions? Mr. Clerk, are there any public?
There's no public comment.
No public comment on this item. Okay. All right. So if there are no other questions or comments, we have a recommendation to delegate some authority, figure out how to make the appropriate 6.2% cuts, and then you also provide the delegated authority for the director for the residual REAP 2 balance funds as well. So anything to add to the recommendation, James?
No, just again, in a really tough budget year, the fact that we were able to prevail on this is remarkable. So and that was a big local push from many of you, letters, testimony, having your lobbyists show up. You made your voices heard. So as I said, this is we don't love the 6% cut, but it's a lot better than 50%.
Right. So if there are no other comments or questions, we're looking for a motion, because it is an action item.
I'll move approval of the staff recommendation.
By Kozlowski, second by Lozano. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously.
Teacher, could I abstain from the motion? I'm a property owner on Harbor Parkway.
Very good. Okay, so we'll note the one abstention by Director Baines. Very good. That takes care of item 2. Next item is informational item. Item 3 is the 2025 blueprint implementation discussion. Housing types.
Chair Villegas, do you mind if I was going to say a little something if I could, just to try to connect the dots a little bit on today's agenda, but also give you a preview to the board meeting coming up in 2 weeks. And again, I need to remind you all that the board meeting in 2 weeks is going to begin at 9 a.m. You're going to hear that a lot and see that a lot. So, because we've been going long, I know some of you have to leave by noon, so a 9 a.m. start time. We're going to hear a little bit later in the agenda. Actually, the last item is going to be a debrief of the Denver tour. It's great to all of you who were able to make the Denver tour. We were just chatting a little bit about that. 20 plus SACOG board members, 2/3 of the board getting there, 5 developers. And I think a lot of very, very pertinent, relevant case studies and examples. One of which is, obviously, we did a lot of focus on housing, redevelopment, right? Redevelopment of the mall and the old airport, but also attached housing, which is we're going to talk a little bit about today, right? Very similar in many ways, market and regulatory conditions out in Colorado. If you go back in Denver 20 years ago, also, they were at a point where they realized, well, we have to both increase our revenues for transportation, but also right size our wish lists. And that's going to be the next item you're going to hear about after this one in terms of what does our forecast look like in this region for the blueprint, the long range plan for transportation. We can't fund all the things we say we need. So some connect the dots. And then finally, just in 2 weeks, the workshop of the board is going to be all about transportation, where it's heading, state policy. We've got a great speaker from the California State Transportation Agency, CalSTA, talking about what the state is investing in and why widening roads is going to be tougher and tougher, but there's maybe some ways smarter to do it. And we're also going to hear from Celia McAdam, who was the former executive director of the Placer County Transportation Planning Agency. So 2 really great perspectives on transportation. I do think today's agenda and that board workshop are going to tie a bunch of stuff together that you heard in Denver. So with that, I meant to do that at the top of the meeting, but I'll hand it over to Don.
Great, thanks, and good afternoon, committee members. So this is an information item continuing a conversation about the housing product type side of our now adopted land use assumptions for the 2025 blueprint. So next year, the SACOG board is going to adopt the 2025 blueprint. And at its core, the blueprint includes a set of land use assumptions for how we as a region can grow between now and 2050. It's going to have a set of transportation assumptions that are married to that land use, and then a set of policies that seek to actually implement that vision. So as James just referenced, right, we just adopted a set of land use assumptions. So that part is now done. The transportation discussion is now front and center. We're going to hear from Zach in a moment on this, but these assumptions are going to be adopted in November. And then we would sort of turn to the policies, the programs and investments that we'll be committing to as a means of implementing those land use and transportation assumptions in the plan. So this is a little bit of a preview, I guess, of that discussion as it kind of relates to a specific component of the land use that we just adopted. So when we look at land use and think about the land use side of our plan, we're essentially talking about decisions around new housing units and employment. And the key decisions are the amount, the location, and the type. So how much growth is going to happen regionally, where is that growth going to occur, and what does that growth actually look like? Across all 3 of these domains, the land use assumptions that this board just adopted are ambitious, and they're going to require intentional action in the policies and programs to actually implement. However, there's also room for optimism that they are achievable if we can kind of continue some existing momentum. So I'm going to go through each one of these just really quick to kind of make that argument. On the amount question, we need to build 278,000 new homes between 2020 and 2050. And as you can see, we've been sort of inching higher and higher in regional housing production over the last 15 years. And in fact, early data suggests that 2023 completed permits crested 11,000 for the first time since 2007. Right, so that actually exceeds our yearly average in the regional growth assumptions for the early part of the plan period in that 20 to 35 period. There's some indications that I think that number could slip a little bit in the immediate future as interest rates start to catch up to us, but certainly a very positive trend that we're seeing in regional housing production over the last decade. Then on the where question, and I know this was sort of a big topic of conversation in the spring leading up to June, the land use assumptions include pretty robust growth in our existing communities. We have 67% of our new homes occurring in the combined centers and corridors and established communities. That's the red and the gray areas that you see on the screen there. And while that's almost exactly the proportion of growth that we've seen in those areas in the last 5 to 10 years, keeping that share as the region continues to grow, as regional housing production continues to scale up, hopefully, is going to take some intentional action, particularly in the region's centers and corridors, those red areas, where we've seen a ton of employment growth, but the housing growth has been a little bit slower to take off. And of course, that's one of the key ideas behind the Green Means Go program that Garrett was just talking about. And then finally, creating a more efficient and compact land use pattern comes with a shift in the types of housing that we are building. Specifically, this means building more attached housing and housing on smaller lots. This is really actually necessary, I think, to achieve a spatially efficient land use. Of course, it's somewhat intuitive. In order to build a more compact development pattern, we need to have more compact housing products. But it's also reflecting some very real demographic and demand shifts that we've seen in our region as well as nationally. So household sizes are shrinking over time in the nation and in our region. What used to be the most common household type, the nuclear family, is being sort of replaced by smaller households made up of adults living alone, adults living with roommates. You're going to hear a lot about in the guest presentation in a moment here, the kind of affordability implications here, which are in part kind of driving demand for some of those attached products and small lot products, as those are what most folks are able to afford. And then, here are our adopted land use assumptions by product type. And we have the share of attached products in our adopted assumptions going from 32% in 2020 up to 36% in 2050. So still, predominantly a single family region. By no stretch of the imagination are we, becoming Manhattan here, but just we're talking about a little bit more housing choice for, again, folks who can't afford that larger lot single family house. And you can then see the dotted areas showing how much new housing in each category it takes to actually kind of deliver that shift. So explicitly, what we're talking about is about half of new units between 2020 and 2050 need to be attached in order to actually kind of deliver that shift. So we're not quite there yet, but there, I think, are some indications that, like the rest of the country, this is sort of the direction that we're headed in terms of demand. And you can see on the left the proportion of new homes that are on large lots that are decreasing lower and lower in our region. On the right, you have housing permits in our region over the last 10 years, and the share of permits that are attached or are ADUs has basically doubled, and we're all the way up to 46% actually in 2023. That's sort of a banner year for us on that front. So again, I think there's room for optimism on all three of these land use components that the board has adopted, but with these interest rates, with some of the headwinds that Cascadia is going to talk about in a second here, implementing both the land use assumptions and the triple bottom line goals in our blueprint are really going to require some policies, some programs, some investments to try to kind of accelerate these trends that we're seeing. So this board is going to have plenty of conversations over the next year on this topic, but this item is focused kind of specifically and kind of giving us a preview on the housing product type question. It's a conversation that we started as a board back in April 2023. We had an offsite board meeting up in Roseville, at which several board members were expressing a desire to kind of better understand the underlying market demand for these different housing products. What was reasonable for us to kind of assume in the 2025 blueprint. And it was based on those conversations that we brought on Cascadia Partners, this consultant, to kind of study these trends, to really provide an analysis of how they're playing out in our region, how they're playing out in some of our peer regions, including Denver. And so they presented that initial set of findings to this committee back in March of this year. Since March, we've continued working with Cascadia, and based off of some requests from the board to continue to kind of bring the development community into the 2025 blueprint planning process, we worked with Cascadia to conduct a series of developer focus groups. Those happened in May, to better understand, from builders, what are some factors that are, influencing attached housing products in our region. What are some of the challenges? What are the, potential solutions and policies that, we can actually make to kind of influence that number. So we have Paul Runge and Alex Steinberger from Cascadia that are with us virtually today to kind of present some of those findings. And staff are going to use questions and feedback from this committee during this presentation, as well as in several others to come, to kind of help shape some of the policies and programs in this blueprint. So with that, I will turn it over to Cascadia. I think Paul.
Great. Thanks, Dov. Great to be with you all. I'm excited to have the chance to speak with you about this topic. My name is Paul Runge. I am a project manager at Cascadia Partners. We're an urban planning and real estate services firm based out of Portland, Oregon. I'm joined today by my colleague, Alex Steinberger, on the call. I don't know, Alex, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And thanks, members of the Lunar Committee. We're excited to bring some of this work back to you. And I am just here to help answer any sticky questions that might come up at the end of Paul's presentation. So thanks for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Alex. So Dov went through the project components that we've been working through: market research, bringing the developers in. We're going to talk today about implementation and what it is you can do to support the movement toward more attached housing. So Dov, if you could, or whoever's in charge, go to the next one. Perfect. So the question we're going to start with is, what happens if we don't sustain the shift that Dov was showing toward more housing production, particularly of attached housing? Like Dov was mentioning, SACOG has not always produced a ton of attached housing. I think you'll recall that last time we spoke with you, we showed that it was behind some of its peers and behind the nation in terms of producing attached housing. And so in that context, we want to say, okay, what happens if that remains the trend? But before we get to that, we sort of have to answer one other question, which is, why does attached housing matter? I know several people have sort of spoken to this, but I'll briefly address it, just that SACOG in its policymaking, in its plans, and in its transportation investments is pursuing a triple bottom line of equity, environment, and the economy. And attached housing is useful for all of that. Attached housing tends to be more affordable, so it helps people access high opportunity neighborhoods. It tends to be energy efficient because of the shared walls, and its denser development pattern reduces pollution by reducing vehicle miles traveled. And it's also good for the economy. When you save money on housing, when you save money on transportation, you have more discretionary income to put into the local economy. Next slide. So in pursuit of those values, SACOG is going to pursue more attached housing production. But what happens if, as in, a decade ago, the trend from a decade ago, what if SACOG does not produce enough attached housing? Well, then I think we can expect to see some of the trends that we have seen over that last decade, in which attached housing and multifamily housing production was too low. So SACOG, compared with its peers here, when we're looking at severe cost burden, SACOG experienced a nearly 5% percentage point increase in the percentage of renters that are severely cost burdened. That's triple what occurred nationwide. It's 9 times what occurred in San Diego. It's 4 times what occurred in Riverside. It's twice what occurred in Denver. Multifamily and attached housing disproportionately serves renters, and when not enough of it is built, you end up with something like this. So this is the sort of thing we're trying to avoid. Next slide. We want to avoid the same thing for ownership housing. Attached housing tends to be some of the most affordable forms of ownership housing. What you have here is a chart of the percentage of households that can afford to pay for a newly issued mortgage on a median home. So this accounts for interest rates over time. That's why you can see the dip on the far right side of this chart. SACOG is in dark black here, the heavy dark black line, and the United States as a whole is in that dark blue. And what you can see is, coming out of the Great Recession, SACOG actually got much more affordable from an ownership perspective as interest rates went close to zero in real terms, and prices fell. But since then, since 2012 on, SACOG has sort of regressed toward back where it was in terms of being more unaffordable from the buyer angle. Now, you're not doomed to this. It's not fate that California and the SACOG region in particular have to be more unaffordable. What we can see is Salt Lake City, for example, in the light blue, Denver in the gray, they had their trajectories change in the wrong direction. They went from looking similar to the nation as a whole to now looking much more like California because they weren't able to keep up with that demand. We don't want to say it's fate. You know, producing more attached housing, producing more housing overall should improve the way these metrics look. Next slide. The last thing that you can expect without policy changes is that you won't keep up with this growing trend. This trend comes from the National Association of Realtors. They do a survey of home buyers. And what they find is that over time, over the last, I guess, decade, maybe decade and a half, there's been growing interest in living in walkable urban communities. That's the blue bar, as compared with drivable suburban communities. So people are more interested in places where they can walk to school, walk to stores, walk to restaurants, even if it means having a smaller lot, even if it means having an apartment or a townhome, an attached home. Gen Z and millennials in particular are, have higher appetite for some of that stuff. But if this was just something that people aged out of, then we wouldn't expect to see the blue bar grow like it is. So the blue bar growing is indication that this trend is permanent. It's sticking with people even as they age into middle age. It's one that you don't want to miss. The market is going this direction. I think developers that we spoke to understand that the market is going this direction. And so the question is, can you set policy that provides for that? Next slide. This one is a little more complicated to explain. So in the interest of time, I think we'll quickly move past it. This is just to say that demand for walkable areas has been quite high in the Sacramento region, despite the fact that there are not as many walkable areas as some other metro areas in the country. So this is something that has been proven to be in demand. And the hope is that policy can help provide for more development in those walkable areas. Next slide. Okay, so let's put this in context now of attached housing production and its history really quick, just to make sure we've sort of captured the idea. So historically, single family units, that's in the gray, were produced more often than multifamily units. But around the Great Recession, that switched. Next slide. Like we have been saying though, the SACOG region did not necessarily experience as much of that switch. Again, SACOG is that heavy black line, and this is the percentage of your housing permits that were multifamily. And so you were down towards the bottom, below the national average, below a lot of your peers for much of the last 2 decades, but it's starting to change, and that's what we're seeing in this next slide. Sacramento has seen a wave of construction activity of apartments in particular is what we're showing here, growing at 17% year over year for the last half decade, maybe close to a decade. That's all really positive, good momentum. And just because the total numbers are increasing, that doesn't guarantee that the share is increasing as well, but that is what we see. Dov showed this chart earlier. We see the share of attached and ADU housing is increasing in the SACOG region. This is what you need to be doing in order to achieve the land use assumptions in your blueprint. And so we're excited to see that progress. Now there are some headwinds that we're about to talk about, but this is a good signal of what's possible, especially with good policy and improved market conditions. So let's go on to the next one. What we'll talk about next is what we heard from developers. Now that we've sort of recapped the data, I know you've seen a lot of that before, but we just wanted to make sure we level set. Talk about what the developers said, and then we'll talk about policy suggestions, and then I think we'll have some time for a little Q&A, maybe discussion. So next. So we had a couple of focus groups with developers across the range of development activities. So smaller infill apartment developers that are focused on sort of walkable areas, and then greenfield developers or developers that sort of are jacks of all trade, do lots of different types of development. And broadly speaking, what they said is that there are local and national forces right now that pose serious headwinds to attached housing development. No surprise to anybody. But better market conditions, better local policy can help with that. And so we're going to walk through all that. So no surprise to anybody, capital costs, construction costs have all gone up. Construction costs have gone up about 30% since the beginning of the pandemic. and capital costs have more than doubled, so interest rates essentially have doubled. Now, the point that the developers made to us, which I think is really interesting for the attached housing conversation, is that this actually hurts multifamily more. And that's because multifamily is largely reliant on renters. Renters tend to skew towards the lower part of the income spectrum, middle and lower income. And so that means that there's only so much in rent increases that they can absorb. So projects essentially go on hold or die because the rents aren't achievable in order to offset these increased costs. For single family, less is the case because it's serving a higher income spectrum. There are still buyers out there who can pay for a higher mortgage despite interest rates and are interested in that, right? Detached single family, has a lot of interest in it. And so those buyers have proven more resilient. So that's a headwind that affects attached in particular. In California, we see that this is considered a risky development environment in general. CEQA is maybe one of the best examples of that. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with the ins and outs of that. But just to say that CEQA can often stop a project or can slow it down. And those things are considered major risks to developers that they need to see sort of a higher profit margin in order to say, okay, I'm going to deal with that. I'm okay with this project taking a year longer and the possibility of me opening my apartment into a market that's different than the market is today. Or I'm willing to accept the risk that this project might hit a total obstacle and might not get off the ground. But I'm going to demand this profit premium instead. So that's a serious macro headwind to go along with the capital and construction costs. All this to say the macro picture, not SACOG specific, the macro picture is that rents are feeling a little out of sync with increasing development costs. And that means that the amount of development activity is leveling off or even turning around and decreasing. Next slide. Now, all that is macro stuff. So, as much as maybe I would like for you to be able to set interest rates, you can't. And so let's focus on some things that are SACOG specific that maybe you can do something about. So here's what we heard from developers. We heard that the SACOG region has a couple of unique things going on that are neat and important to consider when you're trying to come up with your policy response. One is that infill infrastructure is needed here in SACOG. I think you're picking up on that with some of the Green Means Go stuff. But what's clear to us from what the developers said is that there are other cities in which there has been a first mover on critical infill investment and infrastructure investment. So that could be a private market person, it could be a public market person, public sector person or entity. But they essentially go in first. They make an investment that unlocks the development potential of a whole area. But developers felt that that was really not as much of the case in the Sacramento region or in the SACOG region. Another unique thing that developers pointed out about SACOG is that it's not a superstar market. It's not LA, it's not New York. And so what that means, a lot of people might hear that and think, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, in order to attract investors' attention, higher profit margins are needed. So that means you need higher rents, you need higher sales prices if you're going to get the initial equity into a project in order to get it off the ground, get it built. So that's a headwind that is unique to the SACOG region. Another one is that given SACOG's geographic proximity to the Bay Area and how expensive housing is in the Bay Area and labor is in the Bay Area, labor in the SACOG region is actually uniquely expensive because that labor is mobile. It can move and serve, the fringes of or even the center of the sort of Bay Area region and earn higher wages for doing that work, where housing and construction activity is very much in demand. And so that poses a problem. Those workers, when they come back and do work in Sacramento, they demand higher wages because they can get it elsewhere. So developers felt that construction was uniquely difficult here in Sacramento, given that geographic proximity. Next slide. Oh, I guess something I will say is, I don't want to be all doom and gloom with this. We're going to keep going through factors that are unique about the SACOG region. I think everything that we're going through, there's a policy response that can be done to that. So we're going to get into that a little bit more later. But things like Green Means Go, or even with that last one with construction costs, adjustments to building code or adjustments to development standards. Those things can tamp down on construction costs or prevent them from increasing as fast. And so there are policy responses that you can do to make this playing field a little better. Okay, next set of insights from developers. We heard that people tend to agree there's a lot of greenfield land out there in the SACOG region. That is not always the case. I mean, in Portland, Oregon, we have a unique thing going, or in Oregon, we have a unique thing going on with our urban growth boundary. We don't have a lot of available greenfield land within our urban growth boundary, but it seemed to folks that the SACOG region really had a lot of entitled greenfield lands. And much of that was entitled quite a while ago. Maybe it's been updated, but initially got entitled quite a while ago. And some of it focuses on outdated product types. And so developers essentially have a choice. Are they going to build that out and they can do it without as much friction? Or are they going to try to switch towards something that reflects more the market, what buyers are interested in, the price points that they can pay for? But that requires risk. That requires, going through new approvals, making those changes, potentially going through CEQA again. So the amount of greenfield land is sort of the starting point of the conversation. From there, developers let us know that within those specific plan areas that have a lot of greenfield entitled land, the way they're built out tends to prioritize single family. It comes sequentially before multifamily. And that's in order to create a tax base that allows you to bond to put in infrastructure that supports more intense uses. So I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, if this system is always putting off building some of the most critical things, attached housing and multifamily, is that system really working? Is it really serving the SACOG region? And then last, sort of the flip side of this coin is that developers felt that there weren't necessarily enough viable infill sites that were large enough and had dense enough zoning in order for development to be feasible. Now, with all of these points, this is just developer perspectives. Are they absolute truths, or should they be considered scientific fact? No, not necessarily. But I think in every one of these points, there seems to me to be a real element of truth. And I think it helps. It can help guide us towards what the right responses would be to these things. Next slide. Okay, this is the last one in terms of findings from developers. Developers, I think, across the board seem to feel that the SACOG region has a pretty robust and established single-family ecosystem, and that shifting towards multifamily and attached has been a departure as they've been doing, or as we've seen more of that happen. And so, that means there's some friction to making that shift. So there are a couple reasons why the single-family ecosystem is perceived to be really strong in the SACOG region. We know that over the last few years, it's really felt like the SACOG region has attracted single-family buyers from the Bay Area. I think that has provided a well of single-family demand. I think there's some evidence that has occurred during those pandemic years. And we know from what developers are saying is people throughout the development ecosystem, or actors throughout the development ecosystem, whether it's banks, investors, or developers themselves, oftentimes do view single-family as lower risk. See it as something that can be done incrementally, and see it as something that's well understood. Now, the development ecosystem is not a monolith. So there are people, I think, certainly that feel comfortable with multifamily, and we've seen a lot of evidence for that in the data that we were showing earlier. But this all to say, the status quo, I think, has been single family for so long. And it really is this comfort area. And so that's where developers, it seems to us, have stayed whenever they've needed to innovate. So, okay, maybe people can't afford the single family detached house I was planning on building. So my pivot, rather than being towards attached housing, the easy thing is going to be let's make that a single family rental. That's my way out. And then I'll sell that to a big investor. Or maybe I'll shift to a little smaller single family, and that'll be my way to still make this work, rather than shifting to attached. And I think, but what we heard from developers is some would be interested in making that shift. But they don't, because they don't want to go through the headache of rezonings. They don't want to go through the headache of environmental review. And so they try to innovate within that single family system. And we need to ask ourselves, I think, does this reflect what consumers really want? Or does it reflect what that ecosystem has been comfortable with and has been doing historically? And I think the chart on the right is really revealing for that. We see that nationwide, in other peer regions in California, the share of housing stock that's classified as attached to multifamily has been rising. But that's not the case in the SACOG region. And I think, do we really think that that is because, 2 million consumers want this? Or is it more likely that it's a reflection of the policy ecosystem and a handful of development professionals on the margin who are trying to make a risk-adjusted returns decision? And so, I think the governments in the SACOG region are informing what the development ecosystem looks like and what sorts of product types get built. And so we've seen that shift start, and you can build on that momentum and I think change the direction of that arrow there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the last section that I promise I'm going to stop talking and we can have some questions or discussion. So this is about policy solutions. What would help produce more attached housing? We talked about infrastructure at a couple points in this meeting so far. Just want to allude to that. Again, this is something that developers said would be helpful. We know it makes a difference. We know the state of California has sort of endorsed this through the funding that they provided for it. So that's a strong thing to continue. Developers also asked for, and I think it is good policy to continue investing in an attractive public realm. So one of the ways that we talked about that was in terms of amenities. Making sure that there is zoning that allows for example, retail to be close to, or commercial to be close to and mixed in with residential. That's very positive. Those are desirable places to be where there are lots of amenities within a short distance to housing. The other part of this, not our policy focus in this conversation, is just that, developers did bring up unsheltered homelessness as something that, can be very difficult in terms of feeling ready to put an investment in a place that they feel like, maybe there's disorder or something like that. And so we just want to provide a call for continuing to have the discussion about how to best invest in shelter services and housing to reduce unsheltered homelessness. I know it's important to everybody. I know it's a big topic on its own, but we wanted to allude to that as well. Some of the biggest things that you can do as jurisdictions are try to tamp down on development cost and risk factors that are out there. But not all of those fall within cities or counties' purview and are probably better left to the state or to federal actions. So we'll try to go through the jurisdictional ones first. Those are the ones on the left, and then we'll look towards some of those state actions on the right. So in terms of jurisdictional actions, there are a lot of different flavors of housing policy. But I think the broad message that we want to provide is that when you are considering a new piece of housing policy, whether it has to do with rent and rent stabilization, whether it has to do with zoning or development standards, whether it has to do with protections for tenants, what have you, just carefully weigh those trade-offs. We want to have a balanced approach that does not turn off multifamily development. What we see is when multifamily development turns off, we see cost burden go up. We see a more competitive and cutthroat market for renters persist. So that's something we want to avoid. And so carefully navigating those trade-offs to make sure that any costs that are posed on development are sort of balanced out by carrots or balanced out by flexibility and options. That tends to be the right way of thinking about those sorts of trade-offs without getting too specific on the different policy areas. Next is impact fees, a lot of people's favorite hobby horse. The big thing I think that we see is oftentimes jurisdictions have impact fees that don't differentiate between very large detached single-family homes and smaller attached and multifamily units. And what this means is that you end up paying for the same impact for a smaller unit, despite the fact that less of an impact is actually being felt on the jurisdiction systems. And so what we advocate for is making sure that your impact fees are fair, and scaling them by a square foot is sort of the good best practice. And I know the state is pushing that through some of the legislation that's been passed, but we I guess would advocate for jurisdictions being proactive about this, getting in front of maybe when the fee review cycle is coming up and initiate it. And I know SACOG is doing work with special districts on impact fees as well, because I know it does not all fall within the purview of jurisdictions themselves. Okay, last but not least is supporting more multifamily and attached housing production through housing policy or through impact fees only goes so far if apartments and attached housing is not allowed in a lot of places. And so it's fundamental that jurisdictions allow more apartments and more attached housing in high demand places in particular, and high opportunity places, places where people want to live and can live well and successfully. Now, there are some other things that can be done on the state level, or maybe at the regional level. Maybe some of the biggest cities can take these sorts of things on, but are probably best left to those entities. One of the biggest ones is looking critically at building code. I'm sure you've heard lots of tidbits about this over the years, but fire and egress requirements in particular, I think, are really coming under scrutiny. And I think people are looking for ways to align the standards that exist in California with those that exist around the world, in particular as they relate to sprinklers and stairs. So that could be a really ripe area to try to decrease development costs. A good thing about making building code less complex or applying full commercial building code standards to apartment buildings to a lesser degree is that you open up your construction labor pool. Lower skilled workers can work on projects that have less complex code compliance to achieve. And given the unique challenges that SACOG experiences around construction labor costs, that could be a really positive thing that disproportionately benefits the SACOG region. Last on the list is doing everything we can to support attached ownership options. People in America, tend to, there's a cultural sort of, it's culturally favored to own a home, and there's a lot of policy that supports home ownership. And so finding a way to do that that's environmentally friendly, that supports a denser and efficient development pattern that lets us be efficient with the infrastructure that we put into the ground, that's really positive. And so there are a number of state initiatives to try to, enable more lot splitting, or to try to improve the prospects for condo construction. Reforming construction defect liability law and reforming the deposits that condo projects are allowed to take up front. Next slide. Very often, developers talk to us about the pain point that they experience in the permitting and approval process. On the right, you see some charts from HCD about how long it takes different jurisdictions to go from submission to entitlement to permitting, not to pick on anybody. We just want to join that refrain in calling for faster permitting and review and less discretionary permitting and review. Elevating to discretionary review, leaving things at ministerial, can not only move things faster, within the approval process that you have, but then also from a CEQA perspective. So that's a really powerful route to go. We think it's great when jurisdictions set really ambitious timelines for themselves in terms of processing permits and approving entitlements. So we encourage that. And then statewide, I know there have been several efforts over the years to put in place what are called shot clocks for approvals, periods of time within which approvals need to be issued. That's a good thing to support. Everybody should be joining together and setting those ambitious targets. We mentioned earlier that sometimes developers would like to pivot towards a denser plan, towards providing more housing, towards providing more affordable, smaller housing. But they're scared to, because they know they're going to have to go through a new approval process. They might have to go through CEQA again. So support developers proactively. If there's a development that is stuck in your jurisdiction and could be unstuck through a rezoning or through a ministerial approval rather than discretionary review of a change, that's something to really strongly consider. It could unlock a lot of housing production in your jurisdiction that's waiting on the sidelines right now. And then I think support SACOG in seeking CEQA reforms at the state level. It is a unique thing in California that does a lot to slow down development and make developers fear making changes to long-held plans. And so that's definitely something that we encourage you to join the chorus in calling for reform. Next slide. The last thing that you can do is become a pro-housing designated jurisdiction by HCD. This gives you access to the Pro Housing Incentive Program, and it gives you more priority points towards funding application for infrastructure and affordable housing gap funds. So we highly encourage that. It does mean complying with state housing laws. It does mean demonstrating pro-housing policies, but a lot of jurisdictions in the SACOG region have already gotten started on that work. I'm counting 8. And so that's great. And we encourage the rest of the jurisdictions in the SACOG region to follow suit as a next step. All right, that's what we have for you in terms of our report out on the research that we've done, the conversations with developers, and what policy recommendations come out of that. I think our plan was to maybe take some questions or have some discussion. So I'll pass it back to Dov maybe to facilitate that.
To you, Chair.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Appreciate it. Thank you, Paul. Dom, just for time management purposes, I know we ran over a little bit, so to make sure we have plenty of time for the other items. How are we doing on time in terms of what we're hoping to get through today? And then I'll be back.
Sorry, thank you. The housing workshop item, you can turn that into a receive and file, or we can come back. So that one could get punted to
Okay,
the
very good.
next.
So we're good at the moment.
I think so.
Okay, very good. All right, well, thank you for the presentation. Thank you, Dov. So are there any questions, thoughts, or comments on the information provided thus far? Yes, sir. Yep, jump in.
Paul, this is Sean Harris from City UC. I had a quick question. We too experienced a problem with multi-housing modalities not penciling. I think some of it we have room to improve, and you had already mentioned charging by square foot for impact fees versus by door. I think that would be a big one. You also mentioned, we talk about multifamily housing, we talk about single family residential, and then you mentioned scaling down that single family residential. In between that and multifamily, we have the tiny home situation, micro houses or whatever. I see that as a potential opportunity. It's a difference between renting and ownership for a lot of people nowadays, especially the younger people who just staring down the barrel of these interest rates and whatnot. They can't just crack that seal into home ownership. Has that been considered, or are you familiar with that at all? What those might look like? I do get the impression that maybe it still might be considered, prevailing opinion is more of a novel idea or concept, but I'm just wondering if it maybe have any viability moving forward, in your opinion.
Well, I guess two things come to mind. One is that I think that type of housing has actually long been a big source of affordable ownership housing in the form of mobile homes or manufactured houses, essentially trailers. That is, so it's not necessarily a new idea. I think it's a new version of that idea. I guess what I will say is that regardless of whether tiny homes on wheels is something that folks want to promote in terms of home ownership, what we have seen is that developers are building smaller in a way that surprises people. Because I think when people think about, oh, maybe a smaller ownership option, maybe we're just talking about 2 bedrooms, 2 baths. And we definitely do see that. There are a couple homes that just got built in my neighborhood that are under $350,000, 2 bedroom, 2 bath in Portland. And that's really great to see. But I know we have seen nationally, particularly coming out of Texas, some major home builders build neighborhoods now that are 1 bedrooms, 1 bedroom, I think 1 bath. So if it is allowed, you can see if developers want to do it and if there's really a market there. And they can test it for you. You don't have to test it. You don't have to put the money on the line. It's about whether or not they will. And so just allowing those sorts of things is very positive. I don't think tiny homes it's not a big part of the platform that we tend to talk about, but letting people go small, if there's a market for it, is a great idea.
And if I may jump in, Chair, the one thing I would just say is that tiny homes maybe have not quite taken off to the extent that ADUs have in the state and in our region, but a really interesting actually bill that just passed in the last legislative cycle was to allow for the condoization of ADUs. So historically ADUs were connected to the primary structure, they were a rental, And now the state legislature has given the ability for local governments electively to create this condo ordinance for ADUs so that you can actually sell the ADU separately. So that could be a really, I think, interesting thing to get at what you're talking about.
Yeah, I had a suggestion and then a question. My suggestion, maybe in terms of the presentation, the way it's laid out, it has a lot of different sort of bulleted areas that local municipalities or elected officials can certainly look at as sort of a checklist of opportunities to really sort of dive deeper into their own rules and regulations around this in the event that they wanted to move forward and really figure out whether or not their jurisdiction, there are things that still to be done to make it easier to build a diverse housing type. That's just sort of suggestion, because one pagers are my thing. If you can put it all on one
Yeah.
page, it just makes it a lot easier to look at it, digest it, and regurgitate it. And
I
then I
agree.
guess, my question, about probably a half a dozen or so slides back, you had a graphic illustration of what looked like a project. And I don't know if it was coincidental, you indicated that developers have indicated that sometimes when there are, and there was a golf course, I think, that ran around in a circular motion there as part of one of the developments. I don't know if that was just by accident or just as an example.
Just by accident. No specific development was alluded to when referring to that. I can't remember which specific developer.
Yeah,
brought that.
well, and the reason I brought that up is because you mentioned at that same time, I think around that time, that developers indicated that often when they have development agreements already, which are difficult, arduous things to sort of pull together, the
Right.
notion of sort of opening those up or rethinking how they do business and be susceptible to CEQA and other environmental requirements is risky and time consuming and very expensive.
Yeah.
And I just wondered if you were referring to projects like this or whether you were just speaking in general terms.
No, yeah, projects like this, definitely as well. I think it applies across a number of different types of projects and scales of projects, but absolutely. I think the context in which it came up was talking about master plan sort of communities.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So,
Mhm.
any other thoughts or observations?
One thing, and this is more editorial comment than question. On one of the slides, you mentioned the fact that we oftentimes build expense by way of the building code. I think that's something that gets overlooked, and I've mentioned it here before. But I think your point was a little muddy, and I'm just wondering if you could restate what you were getting at by highlighting fire and egress requirements aligned with peers, i.e. rest of world. The standard building code provisions throughout the United States, some time ago, probably in the 80s, changed to make it illegal to have 8-inch tall steps inside of a house. That's not a comfortable stair height, but it's an effective one in a lot of houses. And every time you make the rise taller, you make the run shorter and thus take less square footage. So basement stairs all across the world used to be tall and steep and likely to make you trip, but they took up a lot less space. And then sprinklers have become something that has leaked into the building code and now is required across all residential here in California. And it is following the law of diminishing returns. The number of injuries from residential house fires is very small, generally speaking. The sprinklers help people, avoid catastrophe, but the cost to the world is tremendous to improve safety by a very marginal amount. So what was the point you were getting at there?
I'm happy to respond, Paul, if you want to. But
Sure, go ahead.
yeah, so this is something that has come up a few times, and you're referencing a few of the challenges with the building code, but this particular thing
There's
was related.
hundreds of other examples.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a big code with lots of problems, but single stair is specifically referring to, in this country, we require 2 different stairways for buildings over 3 stories. And that's a unique concept in California and in this country. Most of the rest of the world allows for single stairways in buildings, sometimes up to 8-10 stories, which ironically has actually, it's not really created a safer environment for us. We actually still have more fires than many other countries, including Europe, that have single stair provisions. So this was something that has come up, and I think there's been a lot of interest at the state legislature in kind of rethinking this idea. Maybe we do what the city of Seattle has done, for example, which has elected at the city level to not rely on the state and federal codes, and to allow a single stair up to 6 or 7 stories. But this is going to be critical as we start to think about these smaller scale multifamily buildings, particularly on smaller lots where you cannot have double loaded corridors that look like motels.
How does the city of Seattle protect itself from a lawsuit if all the other municipalities in the state of Washington require something different?
We'd be happy to have a whole
Okay,
session on single stair and vertical shared
rhetorical
access. But yeah,
question for today, but, you know,
yeah,
okay.
I actually don't really know the specifics of the law.
I guess I editorially, I agree with you guys.
Yeah.
We don't pay close enough attention to what gets baked into the building code.
Right.
Period.
Absolutely.
Right. Any other thoughts or comments? So does that conclude what you were presenting today, Dobby?
That's all from me, and then I think Zach's up next.
All right, very good.
And for the record, there's no public comment on this
I
item.
was gonna check with you on that, and I knew you were gonna remind me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. We're gonna drop off.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. All right, item 4 is the transportation project list development for the 2025 blueprint. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Zach Miller, Program Manager for the 2025 Blueprint. So the presentation today is really going to focus on the development and the refinement of the transportation project list for the plan, the 2025 Blueprint. So just getting into the agenda real briefly here, I'll start off with some questions that I would like you all to keep at the front of your mind as I go through the presentation, so that we as staff can get your feedback and input on the process. Then I'm going to dive into the steps that have already been completed as it relates to the transportation project list. Next, I'll touch on what we're working towards. And finally, we'll discuss the approach we're taking to develop this transportation project list for the plan. So a couple of questions to consider. So as I go through this presentation, please keep in mind that the need for the process that the staff is currently undertaking comes out of the fact, as James mentioned earlier, that we simply will not have sufficient money to build all of the transportation projects that were nominated for inclusion in the 2025 Blueprint. And I'll give some additional context and detail on that a little bit later in the presentation. So we're in the process of developing and refining this transportation project list for the plan. And from the presentation and discussion today, we are looking for you all to provide feedback and ask any clarifying questions you may have. So I'd like you all to keep in mind the following discussion topics as I go through my presentation today. So the first one being if there's just any clarifications you need on the process that I'm laying out in front of you. And then if there are any missing questions that would help weigh the project's alignment with the triple bottom line goals for the plan. Additionally, we received 2 questions and or clarifications during the transportation committee meeting this morning, where this same presentation was given, and I'll address those applicable in the applicable section of this presentation as we go. I'll make sure to make note of those questions and clarifications. So where we've been. So the process and engagement to date. We've gone over a number of these steps at previous meetings earlier in this year, so I won't revisit every single one. However, I would like to note those items that will be informing what we'll be talking about here today, the development of the transportation project list, and go into a bit more depth on those specific items. So first and foremost, I'll be outlining later in the presentation the triple bottom line framework of equity, economy, and the environment, along with the policy statements within that framework, which has guided not only the development of the land use assumptions that were adopted in June, but also are being used to guide this transportation project list development that we'll be talking about here today. So in 2022, SACOG staff worked with transportation project sponsors to review and nominate projects for the region's long-range transportation plan, the 2025 Blueprint. So this was really the first step in developing the transportation project list. The next, as part of the development and evaluation of the land use assumptions that happened earlier this year, or as you'll may remember it, the discussion scenario, as it was titled then, a scaled back transportation project list, or a skinny transportation project list, as we referred to it at the time, was developed. So this step primarily concentrated on ensuring that the land uses included in that discussion scenario were served by an adequate transportation network at that time. So during that time, in April, May timeframe, while the land use assumptions were being finalized, SACOG staff continued to engage with transportation project sponsors in order to get their comments and suggested changes to that initial transportation project list that was released as part of the discussion scenario. So this engagement with transportation project sponsors really consisted of we had a preliminary kickoff meeting and workshop in March to inform those sponsors of what we were asking for, when we needed it by, and then to offer to meet with any of these sponsors to discuss and help them navigate the process. So SACOG staff, after that meeting, SACOG staff held meetings with a large number of transportation project sponsors to do just that, to help them navigate the process, talk through different projects, so on and so forth. And then ultimately the sponsors submitted via email and or formal letter their requested changes or edits to that discussion scenario transportation project list. And then finally, SACOG staff consolidated all of those comments that we received and started the process of trying to refine the transportation project list. And I'll be digging into that here in a few slides. So where we are going with this. So with the goal of adopting the final scenario for the plan in November and the adoption of the land use assumptions for the plan this last June, we've now really turned our attention to this last piece of the puzzle, which is the development and refinement of this transportation list. So if you look at this schedule in front of you, which has also been provided as a handout to you, you can see that we plan to adopt the final scenario in November, and that final scenario will essentially be a combination of the already adopted land use assumptions with this transportation project list. So to that end, we'll be bringing you your first look at the revised transportation project list next month in September at committees and as well as board. So today's presentation really looks to set the table for that September discussion by not only providing you with an update on ongoing efforts to develop the list for the 2025 blueprint, but also to provide you with the approach that staff is taking to develop this list and to get your feedback and answer any questions you may have. So now how we're getting there. So I'll be getting into the approach we're taking for the development and that refinement of the list. So at a high level, as James mentioned and I mentioned earlier, we can't afford all the transportation projects that were nominated back in 2022, the real beginning of this process. So we do need to trim that transportation projects, all those projects that were nominated. So this presentation will really be focusing on the policy priorities that staff are using to do just that, trim that list down. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, the process for developing the transportation project list has a lot of similarities to how the land use assumptions were developed. So this slide may look really familiar to you. I think it was something in the same vein was included in the April presentation on land use specifically. So in developing the transportation project list, there are musts and then there's the optimization of it. So in terms of the musts, it must demonstrate fiscal constraint and then it must achieve the greenhouse gas target. That's kind of the assumptions we're operating under. Then we look to optimize for the triple bottom line policy goals and local feedback. And obviously there's going to be a lot of crossover between some of these items, even between the musts and the optimization items. So I'll be going into more depth on each of these aspects of the approach in later slides, but this is really the general framework and approach that we work from in developing that transportation project list for the plan. So let's get into fiscal constraint, demonstrating fiscal constraint. So we'll start with the musts that I just mentioned, and then we'll move on to the optimization elements. So what is fiscal constraint? So fiscal constraint really refers to the requirement that the financial resources available are sufficient to cover the costs of the planned transportation projects within the plan. So specifically, this means that the MTPSCS or the 2025 blueprint must demonstrate that there are adequate revenues from federal, state, local, and then private sources as well to implement and operate the proposed transportation improvements that we're including in the plan. And it also has to be fiscally constrained in the sense of it needs to be, those revenues need to be available within the time frame of the plan as well. So within, by 2050. So the concept of fiscal constraint really ensures that the transportation plan is realistic and achievable within the projected budget and prevents planning based on overly optimistic funding assumptions. So this table in front of you really compares the 5 major project categories from the adopted plan to very preliminary estimates for the 2025 blueprint. So how this was done was we took an estimated budget of around 38 billion. That's kind of our current projection for what we'll have for this plan. And calculated the amounts of each budget category you see here, the 5 on the left-hand column. Using the same proportions that were included in the last plan, the 2020 MTPSCS. So this is very high level. It's really meant to be used as a point of reference, and these are not specific to the 2025 blueprint. They're not final numbers or anything like that. So, but as you look at these numbers, note that while we have some flexibility within funding sources, using the proportions of spending to the last plan gives us a sense of how much budget we have to spread around in each of these budget categories. So this is one of the questions that came up at the meeting this morning. There was a clarification requested from a board member related to how funding was allocated across the 5 major project categories, and if project can be moved around within these categories. So there are strings attached to a good deal of the funding included in this plan, which limits our ability to allocate or reallocate that money to a different project category in some cases. However, there is some flexibility in this process, and we can highlight that further at the September meeting. So the figures shown in the table do assume the same distribution for funding across major project categories as in the 2020 MTPSCS. But if the board wishes to, tinker with the distribution of this funding that has not been earmarked for a specific major project category already, that is a discussion we can have in September or at the end of the presentation here today. So I really want to hone in on the road and highway capacity projects now. So as you can see, the total cost of highway and roadway capacity project nominations in the region greatly exceeds the funding that we anticipate we'll have for this plan. So this means, I'll just reiterate again that we can't afford all these transportation projects that were nominated, and we need to trim those nominations significantly. And that's the process we're, starting to undergo now. Now getting into the second of the musts, achieving the greenhouse gas target. So as you are all well aware at this point, it's essential that the region achieves this greenhouse gas target set for us by the state in order to remain eligible for large amounts of transportation funding for this region. So I'm sure this map also looks familiar to everyone. It was included in many of the land use focused presentations earlier this year. So this map really uses the metric of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, to demonstrate how the land use pattern adopted by the board would perform. As you'll recall, we're estimating that the adopted land use assumptions paired with that very preliminary transportation network that was developed for the discussion scenario, as well as a number of greenhouse gas reduction strategies will get us to around 1% short of achieving our greenhouse gas target. That's a very rough estimate at this point, obviously. So this is all to say that as part of development of the transportation project list, it's essential that these transportation investments that we're talking about, including in our plan, really serve the land use pattern and the land use assumptions that were adopted as part of this plan back in June. And that's really to ensure that we're maximizing our GHG reductions associated with that land use and really making sure it's an efficient land use and transportation connection. Another question that came up earlier today at the Transportation Committee meeting was really centered around whether vehicle miles traveled is a good proxy for greenhouse gas emissions. So although the relationship between vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emissions, it's not a direct one-to-one ratio, obviously, it still serves as a pretty good proxy. So using VMT as a proxy for greenhouse gas, it's not perfect due to the VMT metric not accounting for things like vehicle speeds, for example. However, in our detailed GHG modeling, we do account for things like that, for vehicle speeds, where we categorize trips into different speed bins based on, congestion within the region. And then a different emissions factor is applied based on those speed bins that the trips are grouped into. And then finally, while the speed emissions from travel at different speeds do matter, they're not as significant as the emissions reductions we can achieve through reducing the distance and amount that people do travel. And that's really what VMT is getting at. Here you can see the relative VMT efficiency of the different community types included in the plan. So future development's going to occur across all of these different community types, obviously, as you all know, based on what was adopted for the land use assumptions back in June. So it's going to be especially important to ensure that the transportation investments that we're developing right now and that are going to be included in the plan are supportive of our land use development pattern and do not result in any erosion of the greenhouse gas estimates, which would make it even more difficult to hit that target set for us by the state. I'll also note that we are working with the Air District currently to come back to you as soon as in October for a deeper discussion on greenhouse gases, VMT, as they relate to greenfield developments. And this really came out of discussions and feedback from, recent board meetings as well as committee meetings. So now I'll jump into what we optimize for when we're developing this transportation project list. The first being local feedback. So I discussed the initial call for transportation projects earlier, and I went through the kind of process that we've taken. So I'll skip through those first two items. Those have already occurred. So this third item, the Transportation Project Sponsor Engagement Phase 2, is going to start back up in a few weeks here. And so essentially, we're going to finish developing the project list, a very draft project list that will be shared with you all in September. And then we're going to also be getting that out to local jurisdictions and transportation project sponsors in the region so that they can further comment on it, and we can hold meetings with them if need be to further discuss any transportation projects for that list. Now I'm going to jump into the policy-based priorities that we're using to develop and refine the transportation project list. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have far more transportation project nominations than we do reasonably available funding to build all these projects. So we really need to find a way to trim the nominations, and the triple bottom line policy framework, in addition to the fiscal constraint, needing to hit our greenhouse gas target and incorporating local feedback and priorities is really how we're doing that. So starting with equity, you can see here on the left-hand side of the table that the triple bottom line policy priorities are pulled from, that have been pulled in from the framework. Then on the right, you can see the questions and the overarching metrics that we're using to ensure that these specific policy priorities are being addressed through our process for refining the transportation project list. So take, for example, the provision of access from under-resourced communities to essential destinations. So under-resourced communities are much more likely to be transit dependent for their mobility needs. And thus, by answering the question of if a transportation project helps provide transit access in such a community will really help us make a more informed decision on inclusion of specific projects in the plan. Then moving on to economy. So in the triple bottom line framework category of economy, this table really provides the questions we're asking of individual transportation projects, obviously, as we look to refine that list. So the fix it first triple bottom line policy priority does not include a specific question here on the right, as you can see. However, we do account for this policy priority by really focusing on existing needs, such as bottlenecks that occur today, and by prioritizing improvements on the existing transportation system. By doing so, we're really preserving funds that we can help pay for maintenance. We're avoiding expanding beyond what we can repair and maintain. And we're getting co-benefits by making improvements on existing facilities where in many cases, if you're doing maintenance, it will also trigger, some co-benefits such as bike and pedestrian upgrades on those facilities. Additionally, in many instances, this fix it first approach is also reflected in many local priorities and feedback that we receive from transportation project sponsors. So that's something else to consider. So fundamentally, this policy pillar of the economy for the triple bottom line is being addressed through ensuring that the growth in the region assumed as part of the plan is being supported by a transportation network that will answer those questions listed on the right of the table in front of you in the affirmative. And then lastly, environment. So in the triple bottom line framework category of environment, we're fundamentally trying to reduce harmful tailpipe emissions with this plan, as this is a requirement of our plan that connects directly back to the must of achieving that greenhouse gas target, but also addressing air pollution as part of the federal requirements of the plan as it relates to air quality conformity. So all the questions we're asking of individual projects, transportation projects that are listed in the column on the right will help the region achieve those goals and requirements related to harmful tailpipe emissions. And then finally, these same questions we're asking of transportation projects will also tie back to additional environmental benefits, such as preserving open space, as well as working and ag lands. So this is just a repeat of those questions that I had at the beginning of the presentation. So I'd like to open it up at this point to any questions.
All right, thank you, Zach. Are there any questions initially? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Zach. I have a couple questions. My first question relates to the fiscal constraint and the budget projections. And I was just wondering, how did you come up with those budget projections that you came up with? Did you reach out? I mean, it seems hard to project money going forward right now.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good question for Clint to answer since he took the lead on that.
It is hard to project this far out with certainty. We're looking at federal sources of funding. So the funding that supports, SACOG's regional funding programs, a lot of it goes through competitive grants. Some of it goes directly to transit operators, all of the various state programs. So on the federal side, we're looking, because the Highway Trust Fund or the Federal Transportation Trust Fund is not bringing in enough funding to fully remain solvent. However, the federal government has maintained a policy position of kind of backfilling that funding over time and keeping pace with inflation. So we generally follow that policy. They've been doing that for a long time. So we'll kind of keep pace with inflation on those federal sources. On the state sources, we're
That
looking.
conservative on federal,
That's-
so you're taking the conservative
Yeah,
approach.
yeah, intending to.
Yeah.
And then on the state side, as we're seeing kind of fuel consumption, fuel demand decline, that has a really big impact on state sources. At the same time that you're seeing fuel consumption go down, which reduces fuel tax revenues, we've now tagged them to inflation. And so that kind of cancels out some of it, not all of it. So we're looking to LAO information as well as some other state information that shows you'd be declining actually in real terms by a little less than 1% a year through at least 2030. We do look to some of the other MPOs and the state for that changeover in the road usage charge that the state is looking at now. And we can get into more detail about when that might happen and what might happen over time. But what we're projecting is that you'll see those state revenues decline, and then sometime in the next 10 years, they will find a solution and we can start to see an increase in line with inflation again. And then on the local side, which is about 2/3 of the funding that comes into our region, a lot of that is supported through fuel taxes, some of it through sales taxes. We work with PCTPA on kind of the sales taxes that they're forecasting, with STA on what they're forecasting in sales tax receipts. But then on a lot of the other local side, we're looking back at 10 and 15 and 20 years kind of worth of local spending, along with the growth forecast, because a lot of this is generated through development activity. And then forecasting out, how much local funding are we going to have? What are kind of the state sources, the sales tax that you get out of the state sales tax, the LTF money that come to the region, what are those going to be doing? So all of these have a slightly different forecast to them, but we're absolutely looking to federal, state, and local sources for information on how to forecast those.
That was a big question. That was complicated. I was like, how are they doing that? Okay, thank you. I also wanted to know, on the project lists, are you selecting projects based on those that you feel are ready to go and potentially fully funded? How are you selecting the project list?
Yeah, the priority will be put on those projects that are, in the near time frame. Those are the most important to be in the plan at this point. If they are fully funded and they're moving forward, then they need to be in the plan. Just like when we were talking about the land use assumptions, that for the plan where the actual if rooftops are going up or if there's grading happening, we'd look to base the plan in reality. And so those land use assumptions, those developments would be included in the plan. So yes, we're looking at that in terms of if projects are ready to go, they're fully funded, what year they're planning to be built, et cetera.
I'm assuming not that it's a list that does, or there's projects that are in the plan that aren't going to be on that short list necessarily.
Yes.
But it gets updated annually, or?
It can be, so the MTIP is updated annually, and then our plan, the full comprehensive plan is updated, on a 4-year cycle. So yes, projects that are started would be brought into the plan. The plan would be updated to reflect that. Because they need to be modeled for air quality conformity if they're, a capacity increasing project.
Thank you.
Right. Any other questions? Any public testimony on the side?
No, there's no public comment.
No public. All right, very good. All right, well, thank you very much for the presentation. Very informative. If there are no other questions, we'll move on.
And so Chair Vegas, just for everybody's benefit, right, we're going to come back in September and October as well?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is just to basically give you this is the next phase of the blueprint, right? It's going to be with land use now, we're going to get into transportation, but we're going to get into the specifics. As Zach laid out, we've been working very closely with all the staff. This is a lot of all the jurisdictions, all the agencies, right? So we'll keep on working with them.
And I think I heard that the list, or the preliminary list, or the draft list would be sent to all local jurisdictions input, comments, so that it comes back to us. It's been reviewed by our respective jurisdictions, right?
Yeah, in September, we will have that list out to local jurisdictions before we come to you in September, but the conversation on the list, you'll be seeing it in parallel with some of them. So I don't imagine we'll have got through all of
Fair enough.
the back and forth
But
yet.
similar to the land use work that we did.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right, so with that, thank you very much. That's a lot of work there. More work to come. Item 5 is the Affordable Housing Education and Local Agency Planners. Gregory, welcome.
Great, thank you. Greg Chu on the housing team. I'll keep this item really quick. So we've been talking to all your planning directors in each jurisdiction on just some of the challenges that they're facing relating to planning and housing. And one of the things that we've heard is as affordable housing developers come into your jurisdictions, they face either challenges with it or some obstacles. And we wanted to do a workshop on specifically from the affordable housing development community to talk about ways that jurisdictions can better help that. So a week from today in this very room, we're going to be holding a workshop specifically focused for housing planners to hear from the affordable housing community on ways that jurisdictions can better accommodate that. Some of the other comments that we've heard from your planning directors is jurisdictions are actively trying to bring in affordable housing developers to come in. So the workshop will also be focused on that. So far we have 64 registrants. About 80% of them are coming from your local agencies. The other 20% are either from related agencies from the state or the consulting community in the planning world. And then following that workshop, we'll also be doing a affordable housing bus tour of projects for housing planners to actually see real projects, what some of the challenges were and how the local agencies were able to overcome those challenges. So with that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
All right, are there any questions? I don't have any slips to speak on this item. So is it your intention or is the staff's intention to bring back a summary of kind of what was found and what was learned? And
Absolutely,
kind of where we
yes.
are and-
We'll come back after those two events happen and give a briefing to the committee.
Great. Thank you so much for that. That then takes us to our final item. I know, James, you have a prior commitment, so you have a few minutes here left, but item 6 is the recap of the Denver, Colorado Peer Region Tour. Neil, welcome back.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you so much. Great to see everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to talk a little bit about the Denver Peer Region Tour. We attended this tour June 26th through 28th. Some of you were able to join us on that during that event. And I am Mia Lopez. I was had the pleasure of being your tour guide for this. And I want to share a few highlights that we went through for the Denver region before inviting Artie Zahedani to come and say a few words as a developer on the tour. So what is a peer region tour? Peer regions, they share similarities in each other. So Denver, similar size, they have about 3.4 million people, capital city of Colorado. DRCOG, the Denver Regional Council of Governments, who also attended, taught a lot, shared a lot about what that agency does with our attendees. I'm sorry, I'm going to take a breath. We got to see a lot of projects in action. We had an opportunity to ask some of the leaders in those regions about the projects that were going on as we went through the developments. So our first development that we attended was Belmar. It's a 100-acre mall built in the 1960s. Now, as you can see, it is a great community with townhomes, walkable community, retail. It might sound familiar. We have an area similar to this in Sacramento, Citrus Heights, Sunrise Mall, that we're talking about what it could be like in 10, 20 years' time. We also had an opportunity to go to Central Park. This is one of the largest infill developments in the country. was 7.5 miles former airport, and a tarmac essentially was turned into housing. You can see our group, we got to walk through a neighborhood and see all of the different types of parks and retail that now make up this area. We also had an opportunity to go to Loretto Heights, a historic preservation project brought to the Denver region by the Sisters of Loretto in the late 1800s, turned into a college, and now looking at a new life as a community hub with arts and entertainment and shopping for the Denver region. So these are just a few of the great places that we had an opportunity to visit. You can see our very happy group here. And so I'd love to introduce Artie Zahadahi from St. Anton Communities, who's here to share a little bit as a developer what he took away from that tour, since this is so much, they play such an important role of building the future of the region with us. So Artie, take the stage.
Press, there you go.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mia. I had the privilege of attending. I think you invited 3 or 4 developers to join you. I was the affordable housing representative. Our company, St. Anton, is an active developer and owner and builder of affordable housing in the region. We probably built about 11,000 units and continue to own the majority of them in almost all of your jurisdictions. But there's really no magic to affordable housing development. It's a combination of what we call kind of pancake financing. You just have layers and layers of financing. And as long as you have the ideal site that meets the kind of the feasibility of attaining that financing, you have a pretty good shot at making it happen. I can go into some of that, but the segue I wanted to make into the lessons learned from Denver and their practices and our best practices, and then maybe we can take advantage of that, will just be a couple of bullet points. I think you asked me to talk for 3 or 4 minutes, so I'll go pretty quickly through their style, our style, and how I think we could meld some of the two. So in Denver, what we saw from the 2 or 3 projects that we visited is that they use primarily federal tax credits, private activity bonds, and traditional construction financing, and then permanent debt. We're here in California, we know since costs are so much greater, we're using state tax credits if they're available. We're using impact fee waivers from jurisdictions or somewhat impact fee deferrals as well. And then we go out and try to find grants and other kind of funding sources that are available regionally. They don't have to do that quite as much for a couple reasons. One, their impact fees are far less than ours. For example, if I were building a project, I'll say in Folsom, in some parts of Folsom, it's about $70,000 a door in impact fees. There, it's about $2,000 to $2,500 a door. And part of that is we have the Prop 13 restrictions, everybody knows. So you do have to find a way to pay for infrastructure. So that's one, is impact fees. 2, cost of land there, an acre of land in Sac, Midtown, downtown, and, proximate to the urban areas is probably $1.5 million, $2 million an acre. In the suburban areas, it's about $200,000 to $500,000 an acre, depending on where it is in those jurisdictions. There is about 20% less, 20 to 25% less in cost, based on our research and discussions with the brokerage community. So that's on just the reality of the marketplace. The difference in policy making there. So we talked about impact fees. They have no restrictions on parking. So some of these projects, especially the urban ones, had 0 parking or maybe 2 parking spaces per 10 residents. Here we're usually at about 1 to 1.5 per unit. Because of that, if you're building no parking, you can just go stick frame up. You don't need the podium underneath. So the cost of construction is about 40% less. So parking was a big deal. Impact fees were a big deal. And then densities, that had a lot more flexibility. In the SACOG region, due to regional housing needs allocations, most of the urban communities have a 30 DU per acre minimum. So you have to yield 30 units per acre. I think some of the rural communities aren't, Greg, if it has changed or not, but it was 20 DU per acre. So for us to reach 30 DU per acre, we want to stay to 3 stories or less, right? As soon as you go to a 4th story, you're adding an elevator, you're adding some new structural elements, 2-hour firewalls. It makes it about $30 a foot more expensive. So we want to stay at 3-story. Otherwise, it's going to be infeasible or close to infeasible. And to get to 3-story and be 30 units per acre, and to reach 1.5 parking spaces per unit is very tough. You'd have to get rid of your open space. You'd have to have really small units. So maybe a policy perspective discussion could be, hey, lower parking standards so that these guys can actually build 3-bedroom units within these 3-story buildings, so families can live there. Those are just some of the kind of quick takeaways I took from there. The developers we talked to who build affordable housing said it's really kind of an open door with the jurisdictions. You're able to go in very quickly, get an answer very quickly. We're seeing that in a lot of SACOG jurisdictions, maybe not in some parts of Placer and others, but in Sacramento area, Yolo area, you can get an answer pretty quickly. It's always now non-discretionary as long as you're consistent with their design guidelines. That helps you get a lot of certainty. I think just expanding that would be helpful to all jurisdictions in the area where, you know, you have your rule book. It's typically available online. You look at it, thou shall have this type of paint, thou shall have this parking minimum, thou shall have this open space standard. And if you meet that, you'll never have to speak to an elected official. Just go in, you deal with the staff person. There are no politics involved. Thus, there's no neighborhood pushback. And when we have that level of certainty in the affordable housing community, you're able to close on the land quickly because you know there's no downside risk of it getting blocked. You have no environmental review because you're consistent with the mitigated neg deck that's there or whatever environmental execution they've preferred to choose in that area. But I think those are some of the quick takeaways that I got, Mia. So I'd go with reductions in parking, trying to eliminate construction cost increases by staying to a lower density that's achievable to meet the RENA requirement of 30 DU per acre. The biggest takeaway, and I think it may sound like a broken record, but impact fees really, really hurt affordable housing because, you know, we're going to, I'll use Pat's jurisdiction. So you're going in and you're asking for a loan from the city, a long-term reduced interest loan that's not payable until year 15 typically. Well, you're borrowing this money, it's an obligation, you're paying debt on it, but you're also paying the city back impact fees at the same time, borrowing from that source. So one, that's a reality. You got to do it. You got to pay for infrastructure, but that raises your cost per door because you're borrowing money and then paying it back to the city. And since you're raising your cost per door, it's much more challenging to go out and get bond allocation from the state. Because when you go out, it's very competitive. When you go out, it's what does it cost you per door for this project? And the lower the cost per door, the more likely you are to beat other jurisdictions that have projects competing with you. I brought this up in the past, but in the city of Sacramento, for example, they have a fee waiver program. So if you're 100% affordable, the units that are 60% area median income or below have a full fee waiver from the city. It's amazing. So you get a 30,000 per door credit basically. And that's awesome, right? You don't have to borrow money. You don't have to pay interest on it. It lowers the cost of your application so that when you go against other jurisdictions in the state, you beat them. That's why we have, you know, multiple projects going in the city of Sacramento where I'll use a neighboring jurisdiction. Well, let's say they have a 30,000 per door impact fee requirement, and then they're giving you a loan. It all kind of works out. But when you go in to apply, the project that would have cost you $225,000 per door for the state is now $260,000, and it pushes you out. So you can no longer proceed. But, you know, those are some of the quick and dirty policy discussion items we talked about, what we discovered and learned. They have far less production than we do in California. The way that private activity bonds work, remember, so you have your tax credits and your bonds, and they're competitive. The way it works is that it's based on your census data. So the more people who live in the state, the more credits you get from the federal government. So Colorado doesn't have nearly as many occupants or residents as California. So they don't have as many projects going here, since I think we're up to 35 million or so. We get a lot more, but the Southern California communities tend to get the mass share of those bonds and credits because they have more people living in more density there. But that's a quick snapshot of some of what I learned, Oscar.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Zahadani, thank you so much for joining us. I know it was additional time out of your schedule to join us, but I think everybody found it very fruitful, very helpful to have developers on the trip with us in light of the last 6 months, the conversations we've been having, struggling to try to reconcile with the challenges that we all face, right? And so it was really helpful having you there and others to talk to and really sort of see the same thing and be able to have the conversation. So thank you. Are there any questions of Artie at the moment? I also want to thank me. I know that was a tremendous effort lift on your part. The logistics were not easy. We had to change things on the fly, but otherwise it was seamless. And so thank you for your work on that. I personally absolutely loved it. I wanted to just share. I had the opportunity over the course of the last 30 years to visit Denver no less than probably 100 times. family that lives there. And I'll give you one example of the transformation, and that is my sister, who lives right down the street from the Belmar Mall, had never gone to that mall ever, lives maybe a mile away, maybe two, had never gone there because there was no reason to go there. She's now there every weekend, loves it for one reason or another. She just spends money, but she loves going there, and it's such an inviting. So I was surprised to find it on the itinerary as a great example of just the amount of energy that goes into that project, has tremendous returns on. So, are there any thought? I know many of us were on the trip, so any thoughts or comments on observations on takeaways?
On the trip in this room.
5 of us, yeah.
Thank you. We have, thank you. We have a great team at SACOG that worked on this, so thank you very much. Cool. All right.
Yeah, and again, I enjoyed the range of housing types. I had the opportunity again to kind of see what they were talking about doing 30 years ago. And, since then, they've built a baseball stadium, they've redone the football stadium, they've moved the airport. And really the amount of housing that they're building downtown that aligns and is sort of tracks along the rail corridors is unbelievable. And it's the whole range. It runs the whole gamut. So it's just an exciting place to go visit. But yes, ma'am.
I did have a question. I was wondering why I noticed we had the affordable housing and market rate in the same building.
With affordable housing and the same with market rate. I don't notice a lot of that in the Yuba Sutter area. Why is that? Why don't we have like mixed use apartments?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, a good observations.